So here we are back in this region right here. CO2 is being carried in this red blood cell by this, right? And we talked about the polarity. Here's water, here's CO2, about this polarity here, that water molecule. And this water molecule over here is formed by these two, but in reality, right, remember, oxygen doesn't exist by itself, hydrogen doesn't exist by itself, right? It usually starts with an oxygen molecule, two, and two hydrogen molecules right here, right? And they're going to combine, right, in some kind of chemical reaction sometime or another to form these two water molecules, right? So you got to break these bonds right here, break these bonds, and then connect these two right over here. So this, right, is what we're going to talk about right here. How you go from this to this. Not in this particular instance. I don't know how this happens in particular, but any kind of chemical reaction. Right? How does this actually happen? So from here, you want to think of what we're going to talk about right over here, which is you have to, cells are going to work, and energy is needed to do that work. When we talk about energy, we could talk about this chemical energy that's stored in the molecular bonds, and that this chemical energy is going to be converted to kinetic energy to actually do a lot of the work. And these chemical reactions are going to be involved breaking and forming new bonds. And then enzymes are going to be what make these actually happen, right? So that's what we're going to talk about right here. So for these chemical reactions, right, the terminology here or language we use, you got these reactants, these two things that are going to be changed. They undergo some kind of metabolic reaction, this chemical reaction, and then they form the products, right? So you go from one, you rearrange things in this case, and you have some products, right? So metabolism, right? When we're talking about metabolism, it's just these biochemical reactions. Basically, that's any kind of chemical reaction going on in the cell. Point here, when you do these chemical reaction, it doesn't just happen, right? It takes a lot of energy in order to make this reaction happen here, right? So this kind of is getting to the point of why, we need energy in the first place, fuel, why we need oxygen in the first place, because to get that energy, right, over here, this is the whole point, and also release heat, right? We're going to need this fuel and oxygen, right, to do this chemical reaction, right? So in your body, one reaction we might be doing, this is probably done by a plant this way, but we break down, we take this oxygen molecule, this oxygen bond right here, put a drop of water in, you add this water in, and you break this table sugar into these two molecules, glucose and fructose right here, right? So this reaction going this way, you're breaking things down by adding this drop of water. If we were to make this molecule, we would be building this bond up, right, by removing a molecule right here. There's just two types of basic metabolism, right? Breaking things down, which would be the catabolism, or building things up, anabolism, right? Two types of chemical reaction, right? So why we're doing this, like why we need energy, why we need these chemical reactions, and why we need to make these, right? The cell needs to do work, right? The cell needs to change molecules into one thing or another. Those actin and myosin filaments need to slide against each other to do muscle contraction. The cell polarity of the cell has to be maintained by pumping in and out ions and exchanging stuff with the fluid, right? That takes a lot of energy, right? This is all work. The cell has to survive and to do its job, right? So, when we're talking about that work, right, we're talking about energy needed to do that work, right? So these different forms of energy, right, that are going to be the capacity to do work, could be divided into two types for our purposes: kinetic energy, movement, right? Things moving. When things are moving, you have kinetic energy, right? And then there's potential energy. And in our case, we're really talking about the chemical energy stored in chemical bonds, right? And so the law of conservation states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be converted from one form to another, right? So most of these reactions that we're going to see, we're going to take a molecule, use the energy within its bond to do work in some way, right? Either directly or indirectly. So energy, the capacity to work, two types of energy, kinetic, and we'll talk chemical energy that's stored in bonds, right? I'm going to see how these two interact. And so for all these types of work, you'll notice this little P attached right over here, right? And this is the actual thing that's going to actually make these things move and do their job, right? And this P is coming from this molecule ATP, right? Over here, that's going to add that phosphate group onto these to give it energy to do its job, or make a conformational change. And then in the process, it's going to release that energy, right? It's going to give the energy that's stored here onto these molecules so it can do work. Right? First, we got to make this molecule. So the whole purpose, almost, of eating all this glucose that we do is to take that glucose molecule and break it down, get the energy out of its bonds, right, that are forming that glucose molecule. So during these really complicated series of reactions, which you don't have to know at all, you don't have to know any of this stuff, except that glucose is going to be broken down to get the energy out of its bonds. They're going to transfer that energy to other molecules. And the end result of all this is you are making a bunch of those ATP molecules, right? So glucose is what's broken down. Oxygen is going to be what's called the final electron acceptor, right? That's going to make this reaction happen right here, right? So this ATP will be our sort of currency of energy, right? Once you have this ATP, we're going to be able to transfer this energy onto other reactions, right? Well, that's the whole purpose of glucose breakdown, why we basically eat. Back to this, right? Chemical reactions, where this whole metabolic reaction where we're breaking down, using the energy and rearranging stuff. This whole thing takes energy, right? So when you look at a reaction such as this, right? You have CO2, you have two molecules in here, and it's going to be changed somehow, like CO2 and water is going to be changed into this carbonic acid, which will then quickly dissociate into bicarbonate and a hydrogen molecule, right? But this reaction right here is doesn't just happen, right? It's going to take some energy to get it to happen. You can put these two together all day, probably would not form this molecule right here. So when we look at these kind of reactions, even if the end result is going to be a lower energy product than the initial products, it's still going to take a lot of energy to do, right? And so this reaction right here, when you're going from higher energy to a lower energy, is called a exergonic reaction, right? Release of energy because you're going from a higher energy state to a lower energy state. And then there's also endergonic reactions. Those are going to absorb more energy so that the products will be a higher state, right? But even in this situation where you're going downhill over here, it's not quite that simple because to get from here to here, you have to get over this hump right here called the activation energy, right? The analogy is always you're over here, you're pushing a stone for some reason, you'd like to push it downhill, but first you got to push it up this hill, right? This is the energy needed, this amount right here to start this reaction over here. This is called so-called activation energy. And if you can't get around this, then you can't get to down here, even though it's an energetically favorable, an exogonic reaction. So to get this activation energy, these two molecules, they have to meet with some energy and absorb the energy. For instance, if they're being smashed together, they could absorb the energy of the collision and they could overcome that activation energy, right? So there's a couple of things that'll encourage that activation energy to be overcome. Number one, if you have a lot of molecules, there's a greater chance that those two molecules will smash into each other. So concentration is a big factor, like how many molecules are present, right? So if you're out here dancing on a floor, there's a couple people, it's okay. Once you get to a lot of people, you start bumping into each other and stepping on each other's feet. So that is the effective concentration. More frequent collisions, there's more likely that reaction will happen. And so the effective concentration would help. Another thing that helps if these molecules are moving around faster, and that's what definition really of heat is. When you add heat to something, the molecules start increasing. They're already sort of internal kinetic energy. They start moving around more, and they start colliding at faster speeds, and a reaction is much more likely to happen, right? So reactions, you turn up the temperature, they tend to increase to a certain point. But remember that whole thing about homeostasis, not too much, not too little. If there's too much heat, like maybe enough so that that interaction actually gets above that activation barrier, you're going to denature the protein, right? The protein that was doing this job is not going to work, and it doesn't matter how hot you get, right? So you can't really raise the temperature that much, right? So that's a problem. Even though temperature does increase the reaction, too much temperature will also denature the protein. So the other thing is, besides heat and temperature, one of the things is they actually have to hit each other in the right spot, right? And when they're smashing around each other, if they like back into each other, it might not work. If they hit each other just right, these energetic collisions might lead to a product, right? So the bottom line is all this stuff is what's needed to overcome that energy hump right over there. So you need a way to kind of overcome that initial activation energy. So this is your activation energy, temperature, concentration, right? And all a bunch of chance is going to allow it to go over the hump to get this exergonic reaction, right? But you don't really need to get over this big bump in most cases, because you have what are called these catalysts that are going to lower that activation energy. So you don't need as great a concentration. You don't need the temperature out of physiological range, right? And it's going to put the two molecules exactly in the right position for them to interact together. That's what a kind of a catalyst will do. And that's what we'll talk about on Tuesday with enzymes, right? That's what they're doing right here. They're basically making stuff happen, right, with these chemical reactions. They're going to bring the two molecules together, put them exactly in the right position, and then form either a bond breakage or rearrangement of some sort. So catalysts, they're just lowering this activation energy. And without them, most of the processes that we rely on wouldn't happen. All right, so these type of chemical reactions could happen in a couple of different ways. You could either take a couple of molecules and put them together, right, to form two new molecules. This would be the case of water, for instance. So you take two oxygens, two waters, and two oxygens, two hydrogens, and you get water molecules, right? This is going to be anabolic. As the synthesis reactions is going to absorb energy, so the products might have more energy than the actual initial reactants, or they might have less. It doesn't matter. That's not important. What it is this is going to take energy, more energy than it would otherwise need, right? So this is a synthesis reaction. Something like this, right? Hydrogen molecules, as like I said. Another one is breaking down, decomposition, where you're going to take something and break it down, right? This is called catabolic. You can think of this as if you're breaking down, it's a catastrophe. It's a catabolic reaction, right? Glucose, the breakdown of glucose is this major one. And so these ones tend to release a lot of energy. And, in our case, we're going to capture that energy in the ATP molecules to form that. So these are decomposition or catabolic reactions, breaking stuff down. And again, what I just said, right? Catabolic, when you look at these two together, ATP is the kind of linchpin for this, Right? You're going to use these catabolic reaction to form these ATP molecules, and use these ATP molecules to catalyze or help these anabolic reactions, right? To make these more complex molecules. And then there's exchange reactions, right? Where you're taking these just like the carbonic acid reaction that we saw, or this one, where you're taking the atoms and you're rearranging them into a couple of different ones, right? Exchange. This could be both anabolic and catabolic, depending on what you look at, but it's called exchange reaction. Then there are these reversible actions, which, a lot of them are, like that carbonic acid one. Once it forms, it could also go back to its original state depending on concentration, right? So if there's a lot of CO2, right, it'll tend toward this carbonic acid formation. If there's low CO2, it's going to tend toward this formation, right? So in this case, there's going to be this carbonic anhydrase that's going to catalyze this reaction in both directions depending on the concentration of either one right there. This is another actually important point, which we'll get back into. And then the last type here, which we don't really get into in this unit. I don't know if they will in the next class, but this oxidation reduction, kind of confusing stuff here, but basically you're going to go from this oxidized state to a reduced state or vice versa. And these actions are often coupled. And the basic point of this is that an oxidation is a removal of electrons resulting in a decrease in the potential energy of the molecule, right? And in most cases in biology, we're looking at these loss of hydrogen atoms in a kind of confusing way. But if you want to think of something being reduced, that's going to be the addition of electrons. And so there's going to be an increase in potential energy, right? So this has more energy than this. This has more energy than this, right? So these are carrying energy, and they're going to be used to actually, pass that energy on to other stuff to do work, right? You may ask yourself, if you are adding electrons and you're increasing your potential energy, why is that called being reduced? So those are oxidation reduction reactions. And second of these are often coupled together, right? So NAD is is reduced in the presence while lactic acid is being oxidized, right? So this is getting more energy while this is losing energy. So bottom line here, right? Cellular work, survive and function, cell transport, cell movement. You're going to need energy to do that work. Form of ATP, you're going to get that ATP, right, from that basically breaking down to bonds and everything. So that basically that chemical energy is going to be converted to kinetic energy, doing that movement. All these metabolism, biochemistry, chemical reactions, these are all similar terms. They basically involve breaking and forming new chemical bonds, right? And then enzymes, we'll see the catalyst are going to make these reactions happen by lowering the activation energy.